They fired Jonathan Reed at exactly 9:17 on a Tuesday morning, but the number that destroyed a financial empire appeared just 3 minutes before he walked out the door. Jonathan sat across from the human resources director in a conference room that smelled faintly of fresh coffee and expensive carpet cleaner. Through the glass walls, he could see employees moving through the 23rd floor of Sterling Financial Solutions as if nothing had happened. Some carried laptops. Some laughed at conversations he could no longer hear. 18 years. That was how long Jonathan had worked inside this building. 18 years of balancing books, reviewing transactions, and catching errors most people never noticed. Yet the woman across from him delivered the news in less than 3 minutes. Company restructuring. Position elimination. Transition package. Standard corporate language carefully polished until it sounded almost harmless. Jonathan listened quietly. At 53 years old, he had seen enough business cycles to recognize when a decision had already been made months earlier. Arguing would change nothing. The director slid a folder across the table. His severance agreement. His benefits information. Instructions for returning company property. Everything reduced to paperwork. Jonathan signed where required and thanked her politely. The professionalism surprised her. It always did. Most people expected emotion. Jonathan had built his career on numbers because numbers rarely lied. People did. At 9:14 a.m., a security escort arrived to accompany him back to his office. The walk felt strangely ordinary. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Telephones rang in distant cubicles. Computer monitors glowed with spreadsheets and dashboards. The company continued moving forward without hesitation. Jonathan packed family photos, a framed CPA certificate, and a coffee mug that had occupied the same corner of his desk for more than a decade. Then his eyes landed on a transaction report still open on one of his monitors. He should have logged out immediately. He should have ignored it. But one line caught his attention. Not because it was large. Quite the opposite. The discrepancy was almost invisible. Negative $0.0004. Less than a penny. Less than half a penny. Most accountants would never waste a second looking at it. Automated systems produced tiny rounding differences every day. Yet something about it felt wrong. Jonathan leaned closer. The entry originated from an internal reconciliation batch processed the previous night. He scanned the adjacent rows. Another tiny adjustment. Then another. Then another. All fractions of a cent. All routed through the same automated process. His escort checked his watch. Jonathan had less than 3 minutes before his access would be terminated. He clicked into the report details. The source account identifier appeared briefly on the screen. It was unfamiliar. Not unusual exactly. Just unfamiliar enough to make him pause. Jonathan quickly reached into his pocket and pulled out a small notebook he carried everywhere. A habit from an earlier era before cloud storage and artificial intelligence handled most record keeping. He copied the account code onto the paper. 8 digits. 1 department identifier. 1 transaction flag. Then the screen suddenly refreshed. Access revoked. Session terminated. The company logo appeared against a gray background. Jonathan stared at it for a moment. Most people would have forgotten the discrepancy before reaching the parking garage. Most people would have accepted that a fraction of a cent meant nothing. But as he stepped into the elevator at exactly 9:17 a.m., the number refused to leave his mind. And for the first time that morning, Jonathan Reed felt something far more unsettling than unemployment. He felt curiosity. That evening, Jonathan Reed sat alone at the small kitchen table in his suburban Ohio home, staring at a notebook that contained only 9 handwritten characters. Outside, a cold spring rain tapped softly against the window glass. Inside, the digital clock on the microwave changed from 10:41 p.m. to 10:42 p.m., then to 10:43 p.m. Hours had passed since he left Sterling Financial Solutions, yet his thoughts had never truly left the 23rd floor. The account code sat in the center of the notebook page like an unfinished equation. Jonathan had spent most of his professional life teaching junior accountants that unusual numbers deserved attention, especially the ones everyone else ignored. Large discrepancies triggered alarms. Small discrepancies survived because nobody cared enough to investigate them. He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. The transaction report replayed in his memory with surprising clarity. Negative $0.0004. Then another. Then another. Each adjustment was insignificant by itself. Yet the pattern felt deliberate. Jonathan stood and walked to the hallway closet. Buried behind old tax binders and storage boxes sat a worn leather briefcase he had not opened in years. The brass latches clicked softly as he lifted the lid. Inside were notebooks from earlier in his career, back when accountants performed deeper manual audits because software could not do everything automatically. Younger professionals often laughed at those methods. They trusted dashboards, artificial intelligence models, and automated compliance systems. Jonathan trusted numbers. There was a difference. He carried the briefcase back to the kitchen table and opened a faded notebook dated 2003. Pages filled with handwritten calculations and audit notes appeared beneath the yellow light overhead. He flipped slowly until he found a section labeled Residual Variance Tracking. The technique was old-fashioned and time-consuming. Most firms abandoned it years ago because it required following tiny rounding variances through thousands of transactions instead of examining final totals. Jonathan remembered his first mentor insisting that hidden problems rarely appeared in summary reports. They appeared in the leftovers, the fractions, the discarded pieces. He studied the notes and suddenly felt a familiar sensation. Not certainty, curiosity, the same feeling that had solved dozens of accounting puzzles throughout his career. He reached for his laptop and opened publicly available financial filings from Sterling Financial Solutions. His access to internal systems was gone, but corporate disclosures remained public. He began reviewing transaction volumes, reported in quarterly statements. Millions of transactions moved through the company every month. Consumer payments, merchant settlements, automated transfers. The numbers were enormous. If even a tiny fraction of a cent disappeared from each transaction, the cumulative effect could become significant. Jonathan grabbed a calculator and began estimating. 1/10 of a cent across hundreds of millions of transactions produced startling results. His fingers paused above the keypad. The figure seemed too large to be believable. He recalculated. Then again, the result barely changed. A quiet unease settled over the room. Perhaps the discrepancy was innocent. Perhaps there was a technical explanation. Yet Jonathan could not shake the feeling that the account identifier he copied earlier mattered more than it should. At 11:27 p.m., he closed the laptop and looked once more at the notebook page. Most people would have moved on after losing their job. Most people would have accepted the explanation they were given. But Jonathan Reed had spent 18 years finding answers hidden inside details others overlooked. And now a number less than a penny had become the only thing he could think about. Jonathan Reed woke at 5:12 the next morning, nearly 2 hours before his alarm. For a few seconds he stared at the ceiling of his bedroom, disoriented by the unusual silence. Then he remembered. There was no office waiting for him. No morning commute. No 23rd floor. No company email demanding immediate attention. Yet instead of relief, his mind returned instantly to the same 9-character account code written in the notebook downstairs. He dressed, brewed a pot of coffee, and settled at the kitchen table before sunrise. The neighborhood remained quiet. Streetlights still glowed outside. Most of the town would not wake for another hour. Jonathan opened his laptop and began searching through publicly available industry reports. His objective was simple. He wanted to determine whether the rounding variances he had seen could occur naturally within large-scale payment systems. The answer should have taken minutes. Instead, the deeper he looked, the more uncomfortable he became. Modern transaction platforms typically balanced rounding differences using transparent reconciliation procedures. The tiny residual amounts were either absorbed, distributed, or clearly documented. That was standard practice. What Jonathan had seen looked different. The adjustments seemed directional, consistent, purposeful. He opened a spreadsheet and began constructing a model from scratch. One column estimated transaction volume. Another estimated average rounding residuals. A third projected cumulative totals over multiple years. The numbers escalated faster than he expected. By mid-morning, several scenarios produced totals reaching millions of dollars. Not hundreds, millions. Jonathan leaned back and rubbed his eyes. The calculations were theoretical. Assumptions could be wrong. Data could be incomplete. But a troubling possibility had emerged. What if nobody had noticed because each individual transaction looked harmless? A fraction of a cent was too small to trigger complaints. Customers would never see it. Auditors focused on material discrepancies, not microscopic ones. Executives reviewed summaries, not residual fragments buried deep inside transaction streams. The more Jonathan thought about it, the more elegant the concept seemed. Too elegant. Around 10:30 a.m., he drove to the public library downtown. The building had changed little over the years. The same brick exterior, the same quiet reading rooms, the same smell of paper and aging carpet. Jonathan headed toward the research terminals and logged into several financial databases available through the library's subscriptions. He searched for regulatory filings, payment processing disclosures, and historical transaction reports involving Sterling Financial Solutions. For nearly 3 hours, he found nothing unusual. Then a small detail appeared inside an archived report from 6 years earlier. A subsidiary entity. The name meant nothing at first glance. Yet the transaction routing designation looked familiar. Jonathan pulled out his notebook. His pulse quickened slightly. The department identifier matched the one he had copied before losing access. Not exactly, but close enough to raise questions. He copied the subsidiary name onto a fresh page and continued digging. The trail remained faint, frustratingly faint. Still, a pattern was beginning to form. Individual clues that meant nothing alone started aligning around the same corner of the company. By late afternoon, Jonathan closed the database window and stared through the library's tall front windows. Sunlight reflected off parked cars across the street. People carried shopping bags. Students crossed the sidewalk. Life continued normally outside. Yet Jonathan felt as though he had stepped into a puzzle that someone had spent years carefully hiding. And the strangest part was not the possibility that money had disappeared. The strangest part was that the clues seemed to be waiting for someone patient enough to notice them. The following morning, Jonathan Reed returned to the kitchen table carrying 3 notebooks, 2 sharpened pencils, and a stack of printed reports gathered from the library. Most people would have considered his investigation excessive. After all, he no longer worked for Sterling Financial Solutions. Whatever happened inside the company was no longer his responsibility. Yet responsibility was not what drove him. It was the feeling that something simple was hiding behind something complicated. Over the years, Jonathan had learned that sophisticated systems often concealed surprisingly ordinary tricks. The larger the organization, the easier it became to bury small irregularities beneath mountains of legitimate activity. He opened the oldest notebook and found a page dated April 2004. A note written by his first audit supervisor had been highlighted in blue ink. Never trust the summary. Follow the leftovers. Jonathan smiled slightly. Back then, computers processed far fewer transactions. Auditors often traced residual variances manually, examining tiny discrepancies that modern software automatically dismissed. The method was slow, tedious, unfashionable, but it worked. He opened a blank spreadsheet and began recreating the process from memory. Instead of focusing on total revenue, he tracked hypothetical residual fractions generated by rounding activity. Instead of examining large balances, he concentrated exclusively on the discarded portions that most systems ignored. Hour after hour, he built formulas, tested assumptions, and compared scenarios. By early afternoon, a pattern emerged. Not proof. Not yet. But a pattern. In legitimate systems, residual amounts tended to disperse randomly. Some rounded up, some rounded down. Over time, the differences balanced themselves. The model Jonathan was building behaved differently. The residuals appeared to flow in one direction. Consistently. Predictably. As if guided. He stopped typing and stared at the screen. The realization sent a chill through him. Random errors did not create directional movement. Systems did. Someone had to design a process before it could repeatedly produce the same outcome. Jonathan adjusted several assumptions and re-ran the calculations. The result barely changed. He changed them again. Same outcome. The fractions continued drifting toward the same destination. Outside, clouds rolled across the afternoon sky, while sunlight flashed through gaps in the overcast. Jonathan hardly noticed. His attention remained fixed on the numbers. For the first time since his termination, he felt something stronger than curiosity. He felt confidence. Not confidence that a crime had occurred. He was not ready to make that claim. But confidence that the residuals deserved far more scrutiny than they had ever received. Around 3:45 p.m., he reopened the notes he had taken at the library. The subsidiary name appeared again. This time he examined it alongside historical transaction disclosures. Another detail surfaced. The subsidiary handled internal settlement adjustments. Exactly the type of activity where rounding variances naturally accumulated. Jonathan's pencil stopped moving. Settlement adjustments, residual fractions, directional flow. Suddenly, three separate clues occupied the same piece of paper. He circled them individually, then connected them with a straight line. The visual simplicity made the discovery feel almost ridiculous. How had nobody noticed this before? Then he answered his own question. Nobody had looked. Modern audits measured outcomes. Jonathan was measuring leftovers. The difference seemed small. Yet every major discovery in his career had started exactly the same way. A detail everyone else considered too small to matter. By Friday morning, Jonathan Reed had covered nearly every available surface in his home office with notes, printed reports, and hand-drawn diagrams. What began as a nagging suspicion had evolved into something far more structured. The clues no longer existed as isolated fragments. They were beginning to connect. The challenge was that he still lacked one critical element. He could see movement, but he could not yet see the destination. Jonathan poured himself another cup of coffee and sat before a wall covered with pages secured by small pieces of tape. Names of subsidiaries appeared beside transaction categories. Historical filings sat next to reconciliation schedules. Arrows connected observations made days apart. To anyone else, the display would have looked chaotic. To Jonathan, it resembled a map. The problem was that the map pointed toward a place that officially did not exist. He returned to the settlement adjustment records. The subsidiary that kept appearing had almost no public presence. No major announcements. No executive interviews. No significant media coverage. Yet according to archived disclosures, millions of transactions passed through its systems every year. Jonathan found that unusual. Large operational activity usually generated some visible footprint. This entity seemed designed to remain unnoticed. Around noon, he discovered another filing buried inside a regulatory archive. The document itself was unremarkable. A routine update submitted years earlier. Most readers would have skipped directly to the summary section. Jonathan ignored the summary and studied the transaction routing tables instead. 10 minutes later, he stopped reading. Then he read the page again. One routing designation appeared repeatedly beside categories involving residual settlement adjustments. The code matched part of the identifier he had copied on his final day at Sterling. His heartbeat quickened slightly. For days, he had been following assumptions. Now he was looking at something tangible. He opened a new spreadsheet and entered every reference he could find connected to the routing designation. Dates, filing numbers, transaction categories, processing entities. Patterns began appearing immediately. The same designation surfaced again and again whenever residual balances were discussed. Not large balances, tiny balances, fractions, rounding remnants, leftover amounts that existed beneath normal reporting thresholds. Jonathan zoomed out and examined the broader picture. Suddenly a possibility emerged that he had not fully considered before. What if the residuals were not simply disappearing? What if they were being collected? The idea seemed almost absurd at first. Yet the more he examined the available evidence, the more logical it became. Collection required a destination. A destination required an account. And an account required ownership. For the first time, Jonathan stopped asking whether the residuals were moving. He began asking where they were going. Hours passed as he traced references through public records and historical disclosures. Most trails ended in dead ends. A few produced useful details. Then, shortly before sunset, he found something that made him sit perfectly still. Hidden within an old corporate structure document was a reference to an internal reserve account associated with the same processing chain he had been tracking all week. The account name itself revealed almost nothing. Generic, administrative, forgettable, exactly the kind of label nobody would question. Yet the account appeared repeatedly wherever residual settlements accumulated. Jonathan circled the reference and stared at the page. The destination had finally revealed itself. Not completely, not enough to prove anything, but enough to confirm that the fractions were not vanishing into thin air. They were flowing somewhere. And for the first time since leaving Sterling Financial Solutions, Jonathan felt certain that he was no longer chasing a theory. He was following a trail. Saturday arrived with clear skies and unusually warm temperatures for early spring. Jonathan Reed had barely noticed. For the third consecutive day, he was awake before sunrise, seated at his desk with a fresh legal pad and a growing collection of evidence spread across the room. The discovery of the reserve account had changed everything. Until now, he had been searching for proof that residual fractions moved through the system in a deliberate way. Now he had something far more important. A destination. The question was no longer whether the money traveled somewhere. The question was how much money had traveled there. Jonathan opened a new spreadsheet and began constructing the most conservative estimate possible. He deliberately chose the smallest transaction volumes supported by public filings. He selected the lowest residual values that still matched the patterns he had observed. If his assumptions were wrong, he wanted them to be wrong on the side of caution. Hours passed as rows filled with calculations. Transaction categories, settlement frequencies, historical processing volumes. Every figure came directly from public disclosures. Every assumption was documented. Jonathan knew that conclusions meant nothing without methodology. Around noon, he leaned back and stared at the result. The figure displayed at the bottom of the spreadsheet exceeded $6 million. He frowned immediately. The number felt too large. Not because it was impossible, but because it came from deliberately conservative assumptions. He checked every formula again. Then again, the outcome remained unchanged. Jonathan adjusted the model using more realistic transaction volumes. The estimate climbed above $12 million. He modified additional variables. 18 million. Another adjustment pushed the figure beyond 25 million. Silence filled the room. The only sound came from the soft hum of the desktop computer. Jonathan folded his arms and stared through the window. He remembered hundreds of audit meetings throughout his career. Executives worried about six-figure discrepancies. Regulators examined seven-figure variances. Yet here he sat, using publicly available information, arriving at estimates that reached levels no routine audit should ever overlook. Something was fundamentally wrong. He printed several versions of the model and spread them across the desk. Then he began searching for independent confirmation. If the residual accumulation theory was accurate, traces should appear elsewhere. Hidden, indirect, but present. By late afternoon, he found exactly that. Historical growth figures associated with the reserve account showed expansion rates that exceeded normal operational requirements. Not dramatically, just enough to raise questions. A few percentage points here, a few percentage points there. Small enough to avoid attention, large enough to matter over time. Jonathan circled the figures repeatedly. The pattern matched what his model predicted. The fractions appeared to accumulate year after year without interruption. He opened his notebook and wrote a sentence across the top of a blank page. If the account receives residual settlements continuously, then someone must be monitoring it continuously. The implication lingered in his mind. Systems did not manage themselves. Accounts did not maintain themselves. Someone had oversight responsibility. Someone received reports. Someone understood exactly how the process worked. As evening approached, Jonathan organized the growing stack of documents into separate folders. For the first time, the investigation felt larger than a technical anomaly. The reserve account no longer looked like an accounting curiosity. It looked like infrastructure, a mechanism built to collect something valuable. And if his calculations were even partially correct, the value involved was not measured in cents. It was measured in millions. Jonathan Reed spent most of Sunday organizing evidence, refining calculations, and testing assumptions he had already tested multiple times. Experience had taught him a simple rule. The more extraordinary a conclusion appeared, the stronger the supporting evidence needed to be. By late afternoon, he had reached the point where additional spreadsheets provided diminishing returns. The numbers continued pointing in the same direction. The reserve account continued appearing at the center of every path he traced. Yet one question remained unanswered. Who knew it existed? As sunlight faded outside his office window, Jonathan turned his attention toward corporate records rather than financial reports. Large organizations generated endless documentation, board updates, management disclosures, administrative filings. Most people never read them. Jonathan had built an entire career reading exactly the documents everyone else ignored. He searched through archived filings stretching back nearly a decade. Hundreds of pages passed before his eyes. Most contained routine information, executive changes, compliance updates, operational adjustments. Then a subtle pattern emerged. The reserve account never appeared by name in high-level summaries. It only surfaced indirectly through technical references buried inside supporting documentation. Jonathan found that unusual. Significant operational accounts typically appeared somewhere in management discussions. This one seemed carefully compartmentalized. He began tracking every individual connected to the documents where the references appeared. Department heads, financial controllers, operations managers. Most names appeared once or twice. A few appeared repeatedly. Around 7:15 p.m., Jonathan noticed something else. One executive approval chain surfaced again and again whenever settlement infrastructure changed. The name belonged to a senior vice president named Gregory Hale. Jonathan recognized it immediately. Hale had spent years climbing through the company hierarchy before becoming one of Sterling's most influential executives. Jonathan had seen him at quarterly meetings. Calm, intelligent, highly respected. The discovery itself proved nothing. Senior executives approved countless projects. Yet the frequency of Hale's involvement caught Jonathan's attention. He opened a fresh notebook page and wrote the name at the top. Then he listed every connection he could document. Settlement systems, reconciliation updates, infrastructure modernization projects, internal reserve management. One by one, the references accumulated beneath the name. The pattern remained circumstantial. Still, it was impossible to ignore. Jonathan leaned back and stared at the page. For the first time, the investigation had attached itself to a real person. Not an account, not a routing designation, not a subsidiary entity. A human being. Someone who attended meetings, signed documents, reviewed reports. Someone who potentially understood how the system functioned. The realization made Jonathan uncomfortable. Numbers felt objective. People complicated everything. He stood and walked into the kitchen for a glass of water. The house was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. Looking out into the dark backyard, he considered walking away. He had already uncovered more than enough to satisfy his curiosity. He had no obligation to continue. No employer paying him. No authority supporting him. Yet the thought lasted only a few seconds. Because another realization followed immediately. If he could connect these pieces using only public information and an outdated audit technique, someone inside the company should have noticed long ago. Unless they already had. Jonathan returned to his desk and studied the evidence once more. The fractions led to the reserve account. The reserve account led to settlement infrastructure. The infrastructure repeatedly led back to the same executive chain. The trail was no longer theoretical. It was becoming personal. And for the first time since he left Sterling Financial Solutions, Jonathan wondered whether someone else might already know he was following it. Monday morning, Jonathan Reed made a decision he had avoided for days. He needed another set of eyes. Not because he doubted his calculations, but because extraordinary conclusions demanded independent scrutiny. Shortly after 9 o'clock, he called an old colleague named Michael Carson. The two men had worked together for nearly 12 years before Michael accepted a position at a regional consulting firm. Michael was intelligent, experienced, and practical. More importantly, he was someone Jonathan trusted to challenge weak assumptions. They agreed to meet for lunch at a small diner located halfway between their homes. The restaurant had not changed in decades. Vinyl booths lined the walls. Ceiling fans turned lazily overhead. The smell of coffee and grilled sandwiches filled the air. Jonathan arrived carrying a folder thick with notes, calculations, and printed records. Michael listened patiently as Jonathan explained the residual settlement patterns, the reserve account, and the historical filings. For nearly 40 minutes, he walked through every step of his reasoning. When he finished, Michael sat quietly for a moment before taking a sip of coffee. Then he shook his head. Not because the numbers were wrong. Because the conclusion sounded impossible. You are telling me that a major financial company has allowed millions of dollars to accumulate through rounding residuals for years and nobody noticed? Jonathan expected the reaction. I am telling you that the numbers suggest exactly that. Michael frowned. Internal auditors would catch it. Jonathan slid several documents across the table. Then explain why the reserve account keeps appearing in settlement records but never appears in management summaries. Michael reviewed the pages carefully. His confidence faded slightly. He turned another page, then another. Yet after nearly 10 minutes, he pushed the folder back across the table. I still think there is another explanation. Jonathan nodded. So do I. I just have not found it yet. The conversation continued for another hour. Michael challenged assumptions. Jonathan answered questions. Every alternative theory eventually collided with the same obstacle. The fractions moved somewhere. The account existed. The accumulation patterns remained unusually consistent. Yet despite all that, Michael refused to accept the broader implication. As they stood to leave, he offered one final opinion. You were terminated less than 2 weeks ago. Be careful that you are not looking for meaning where there is none. The comment was not cruel. It was sincere, and that made it harder to dismiss. During the drive home, Jonathan replayed the conversation repeatedly. For a brief moment, uncertainty returned. What if Michael was right? What if frustration and curiosity had combined into a convincing illusion? Once home, Jonathan reopened his files and reviewed the evidence from the beginning. The same pattern emerged. The same calculations. The same account references. Nothing changed. By evening, he felt confident once again. Yet Michael's reaction revealed something important. Intelligent people resisted the conclusion even after seeing the evidence. Not because the evidence was weak, because the idea itself violated expectations. Large institutions were supposed to have safeguards, audits, compliance reviews, oversight committees. Entire departments existed to prevent hidden financial activity. The system should have detected the pattern years ago, unless the pattern was designed to look ordinary. Jonathan closed the final folder and looked across the room at the growing wall of notes. For days, he had assumed the challenge was finding evidence. Now he realized the challenge might be convincing anyone to believe it. And that problem was proving far more difficult. Tuesday morning began with a question Jonathan Reed could no longer ignore. If the reserve account had accumulated millions of dollars over time, where did those funds ultimately go? Collection alone explained only part of the story. Money that entered an account usually left an account. The movement might be legitimate. It might be administrative. Or it might reveal everything. Jonathan spent the first several hours reviewing every publicly available document connected to the settlement structure he had mapped during the previous week. He searched annual disclosures, archived financial statements, regulatory supplements, and historical corporate records. Most references led nowhere. Yet shortly after 11 o'clock, a small inconsistency appeared. The reserve account's reported balances did not follow a normal operational pattern. The account grew steadily for extended periods, then experienced occasional reductions that were difficult to explain. The withdrawals were never large enough to attract attention individually. In fact, they seemed carefully sized to appear routine. Jonathan opened a fresh spreadsheet and began documenting every balance change he could reconstruct from available records. One withdrawal occurred 3 years earlier. Another appeared 18 months later. A third followed roughly 11 months after that. Viewed separately, the transactions seemed harmless. Viewed together, they formed a pattern. The reductions occurred shortly after internal restructuring events involving the same settlement infrastructure Jonathan had been tracking. His pulse quickened. He entered dates into a timeline and compared them against executive approval records. The alignment was not perfect, but it was close enough to demand further investigation. Then another detail surfaced. Several of the restructuring projects had been authorized through the same executive chain he had already identified. Gregory Hale's name appeared again. Not everywhere, just often enough. Jonathan leaned forward and reread the documents carefully. Nothing directly connected Hale to the reserve account. Nothing directly connected anyone to improper activity. Yet the overlap continued growing. Infrastructure changes, settlement modifications, administrative transfers. The same names appeared repeatedly around the edges. Around 2 o'clock, Jonathan printed the timeline and pinned it beside the rest of his evidence wall. For several minutes, he simply stared at it. Sometimes the human brain recognized relationships before logic fully explained them. This felt like one of those moments. The fractions accumulated. The reserve account collected them. The balance increased steadily. Then periodic transfers reduced the balance. The transfers aligned with internal projects approved through a familiar executive network. Individually, each fact seemed ordinary. Together, they formed a picture that was becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss. Jonathan picked up a red marker and circled every event connected to the account. When he stepped back, the page looked different. The pattern no longer resembled random accounting activity. It resembled a system. a system with inputs, storage, and controlled outputs. Late that afternoon, sunlight stretched across the office floor as Jonathan reviewed the timeline one final time. That was when he noticed something he had missed entirely. One of the administrative transfers referenced a project code associated with an entity that did not appear anywhere else in public reporting. The code was obscure, easy to overlook, yet it sat directly beside one of the largest balance reductions he had identified. Jonathan wrote the code into his notebook and underlined it twice. For days he had been following the money. Now, for the first time, it appeared the money might be leading him somewhere specific. Wednesday morning, Jonathan Reed focused entirely on the mysterious project code he had discovered the previous afternoon. Unlike the reserve account, which appeared occasionally in public disclosures, this code seemed almost invisible. Searches returned very little. Corporate reports barely mentioned it. Regulatory filings referenced it only in passing. Yet the more Jonathan examined the available records, the more unusual its absence became. Large financial initiatives typically generated documentation trails. Budgets, approvals, implementation schedules, compliance reviews. This project appeared to exist without leaving the normal footprints. That alone made it worth investigating. Jonathan began tracing every document that contained a code. Most references were buried inside appendices and technical supplements that few people ever read. After several hours, a pattern emerged. The project was consistently associated with settlement optimization initiatives. The phrase sounded harmless, efficient even, the kind of language executives used when discussing operational improvements. Yet every time the project appeared, it seemed connected to the same infrastructure Jonathan had already mapped. Settlement adjustments, residual balances, internal reserve activity. By lunchtime, he had assembled enough references to construct a rough timeline. The project first appeared almost 8 years earlier. Shortly afterward, the reserve account began growing more rapidly. Several years later, another phase of the project launched. Once again, reserve account activity increased. Jonathan studied the sequence carefully. Correlation did not prove causation. He knew that better than anyone. But patterns mattered, especially when they repeated. He printed the timeline and placed it beside the wall of evidence already covering half his office. The visual impact surprised even him. Separate clues collected over days now, connected into a surprisingly coherent structure. The fractions flowed into the reserve account. The reserve account aligned with settlement infrastructure. Settlement infrastructure aligned with the optimization project. And the project repeatedly intersected with executive approvals connected to Gregory Hale. Jonathan stared at the wall for several minutes. The system no longer looked accidental. It looked engineered. Around 3 o'clock, he discovered something else. Hidden inside an archived investor presentation was a brief reference to operational efficiency gains achieved through proprietary transaction processing methods. The statement occupied only a single sentence. Most readers would have skipped past it without hesitation. Jonathan enlarged the slide and read it several times. Proprietary processing methods. The phrase lingered in his mind. What if the rounding behavior was not an unintended consequence of the system? What if it was part of the system itself? The possibility changed everything. Until now, Jonathan had assumed someone might be exploiting an existing process. But a more troubling explanation was beginning to emerge. The process may have been designed from the beginning to produce the exact outcome he was observing. He opened his notebook and wrote 3 words in large block letters. Not a bug. Then he underlined them twice. As evening approached, golden sunlight filtered through the office window, casting long shadows across the stacks of documents. Jonathan reviewed every major conclusion he had reached since leaving Sterling Financial Solutions. For the first time, they all pointed toward the same destination. The fractions were not wandering through the system. They were being guided. And if that conclusion proved correct, then someone had spent years ensuring that the mechanism remained hidden in plain sight. Thursday morning began with something Jonathan Reed had not experienced since starting his investigation. Doubt. Not doubt about the numbers. The numbers remained consistent. The calculations still pointed toward the same conclusion. The doubt came from a different question. What exactly was he supposed to do with what he had found? For nearly 2 weeks, he had operated under a simple assumption. If enough evidence accumulated, the truth would become obvious. Yet the opposite seemed to be happening. The more evidence he gathered, the more complicated the situation became. Jonathan spent the morning organizing every document into chronological order. Timelines covered one wall. Financial models occupied another. Regulatory references filled multiple folders. The investigation had grown far beyond the curiosity that began with a tiny rounding discrepancy. It now represented hundreds of hours of analysis. Still, one uncomfortable reality remained. Everything depended on public information. He had identified patterns. He had mapped relationships. He had uncovered a mechanism that appeared designed to collect value from residual transactions. But he still lacked direct confirmation from inside the system. Around noon, he sat down at his computer and began reviewing archived records one more time. That was when he noticed something unusual. Several documents he had previously accessed through a public database no longer appeared in search results. At first, he assumed the database had updated its indexing system. Such things happen regularly. Yet after searching multiple ways, he still could not locate files he distinctly remembered downloading only days earlier. Jonathan opened his local copies and compared them against the database records. The documents existed in his archive. The references remained real, but the public links had vanished. He frowned and checked additional records. The same pattern appeared again. Not everywhere, only in certain places. Specifically, around settlement infrastructure documentation connected to the project code he had been tracing. The discovery might have been harmless. Databases changed constantly. Records moved. Search functions failed. Yet the timing felt strange. For the first time, Jonathan considered a possibility he had been avoiding. What if someone else had noticed the same connections? He immediately pushed the thought aside. It sounded paranoid. Organizations updated records every day. There was no reason to assume anything more. Still, he began creating backup copies of every document in his possession. Multiple folders, multiple storage locations, printed versions whenever possible. Years of audit work had taught him another valuable lesson. Preserve evidence before analyzing evidence. By late afternoon, stacks of organized files covered his desk. Looking at them, Jonathan realized something important. Whether intentional or accidental, the system he had uncovered depended on complexity. Layers of entities, layers of approvals, layers of technical language. Every component appeared ordinary when viewed individually. Only when assembled together did the larger picture emerge. As sunlight faded beyond the window, Jonathan reviewed the evidence wall one final time. Fractions, reserve accounts, settlement infrastructure, project codes, executive approvals. Each piece reinforced the next. For days, he had been searching for a flaw in his own reasoning. A mistake, a missing explanation. Instead, every new discovery strengthened the original conclusion. The mechanism was not hidden because it was sophisticated. It was hidden because almost nobody would ever spend enough time looking at something so small. And that realization was becoming harder to ignore than any number he had ever calculated. Friday morning, Jonathan Reed made the most important decision of his investigation. He stopped searching for new clues. For nearly 3 weeks, he had been collecting fragments, verifying assumptions, and testing theories from every possible angle. The evidence wall in his office was now complete. Additional research might add detail, but it would not change the overall picture. The fractions flowed through a specific process. The process fed a reserve account. The reserve account connected to settlement infrastructure. The infrastructure aligned with a project that appeared intentionally designed to manage residual transaction values. Whether the mechanism violated regulations would ultimately be determined by investigators. But Jonathan no longer questioned the existence of the mechanism itself. It was real. The challenge now was presenting it clearly enough for someone else to understand. He spent the morning building what auditors called a narrative package, not a collection of documents, a story supported by documents. Years of professional experience had taught him that raw data rarely persuaded anyone. People needed context. They needed chronology. They needed to see how one fact connected logically to the next. Jonathan organized every finding into a structured report. Section 1 explained the residual settlement pattern. Section 2 documented the reserve account. Section 3 traced the account through settlement infrastructure records. Section 4 connected the infrastructure to the optimization project. Section 5 outlined the financial impact using conservative estimates supported entirely by public information. He deliberately excluded speculation. No accusations. No assumptions about intent. Just evidence. Around noon, he printed the report. The stack measured nearly 2 inches thick. Hundreds of pages supported conclusions that originated from a discrepancy smaller than a penny. Jonathan found the irony impossible to ignore. Some of the largest discoveries of his career had begun exactly the same way. Tiny details. Overlooked entries. Numbers considered too small to matter. He spent the afternoon reviewing every page one final time. Names, dates, references, calculations. If someone challenged the report, he wanted every statement supported by documentation. By 4 o'clock, he was satisfied. The report was not perfect. No investigation ever was. But it was honest, thorough, defensible. He placed copies into 3 separate binders and created digital backups stored in multiple locations. Then he drafted a formal summary letter addressed to financial regulators responsible for reviewing potential reporting irregularities. The language remained measured and professional. He did not claim certainty. He requested examination. He did not allege wrongdoing. He presented evidence. As evening approached, Jonathan sat quietly at his desk and looked around the room. The evidence wall remained covered with notes. Red circles connected account references. Timelines stretched across multiple sheets of paper. 3 weeks earlier, none of it existed. There had only been a small discrepancy on a transaction report moments before his access disappeared forever. Now an entire system stood revealed. Not because Jonathan possessed extraordinary technology. Not because he had access to secret records. Because he followed the leftovers. The fractions everyone else ignored. He sealed the final envelope and placed it beside the binders. Monday morning, the report would leave his possession and enter the hands of people with authority to investigate further. For the first time since his termination, Jonathan felt something unexpected. Relief. His work was finished. Whatever happened next would belong to the facts themselves. The report left Jonathan Reed's hands on a Monday morning and entered a process he could no longer control. For several weeks, nothing appeared to happen. Life settled into an unfamiliar routine. He applied for new positions, answered recruiters, and tried to rebuild the future he thought he had lost. Yet every few days, he checked the mailbox and refreshed his email, wondering whether anyone had actually read the hundreds of pages he had assembled. Then, late one Thursday afternoon, the first response arrived. It was brief, professional, and carefully worded. Regulators had reviewed the materials and requested additional supporting documentation. Jonathan read the message twice before setting the phone down. They were taking it seriously. Over the following months, the requests continued. Clarifications, source records, methodology explanations. Every question focused on evidence. Every answer traced back to the same principle that had guided the investigation from the beginning. Follow the leftovers. Slowly, other developments began appearing in public. Regulatory inquiries, disclosure reviews, internal examinations. Financial publications started asking questions about settlement accounting practices. Analysts noticed inconsistencies that had remained hidden for years. What had once existed as a tiny discrepancy buried inside millions of transactions was now attracting attention from professionals across the industry. Then came the announcement. Sterling Financial Solutions disclosed that an independent review had identified significant issues involving the treatment and allocation of residual settlement balances. Additional investigations followed. Senior executives resigned. Oversight committees were restructured. Policies were rewritten. Systems that had operated quietly for years were suddenly subjected to scrutiny. Jonathan watched the news coverage from the same home office where the investigation had begun. The evidence wall was gone now. The papers had been archived. The notes had been organized into storage boxes. Yet seeing the story unfold across national financial publications felt strangely unreal. The numbers he had followed for weeks were no longer private observations. They had become public facts. Several months later, one final report summarized the findings. Millions of dollars in accumulated residual transaction value had moved through mechanisms that regulators concluded required substantially greater transparency and oversight. Reading the report, Jonathan felt no triumph, only satisfaction. The outcome had never been about revenge for losing his job. It had never been about proving himself smarter than anyone else. It was about something much simpler. Numbers mattered. Details mattered. Tiny things mattered, because sometimes the smallest fraction of a cent could reveal the largest truth in the room. One autumn afternoon, nearly a year after his termination, Jonathan accepted a new position with a financial consulting firm specializing in audit controls and compliance systems. During his first week, a young accountant asked him what the most important lesson of his career had been. Jonathan smiled before answering. He told her that major problems rarely announce themselves. They hide inside ordinary reports, routine transactions, and numbers everyone else ignores. The young accountant wrote the advice down. Jonathan hoped she would remember it, because the discovery that changed everything had not started with millions of dollars. It had started with a number so small that almost nobody thought it was worth noticing. And that was the day the numbers finally spoke for themselves. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to the channel, leaving a like, and sharing it with someone who appreciates stories where patience, integrity, and attention to detail make all the difference.